Welcome, everybody. I'm John Rosenfield, senior scientist with San Francisco Baykeeper. I'm a fish biologist by training, and I've spent most of my career at the interface of conservation science and water policy in California and throughout the southwestern United States. I'm coming to you today from what is known as Berkeley, California, but it's also known as Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. I have with me today a great panel, including Jacob Morrison, who just made the film that you saw. Jacob is a director, writer, producer, and editor. His featured directorial debut, River's End, premiered at the 2021 Wild and Scenic Film Festival, where it won both the Jury Award and the People's Choice Award. Congratulations, Jacob. Jacob has also produced series for Viceland and Fullscreen, written and starred in an explainer series for Vice, and directed a half-hour television pilot. Kate Poole is the Senior Director of the Water Division of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Nature Program. She has been with NRDC since 2004, serving as lead counsel in several important cases aimed at protecting imperiled species from the effects of California's federal and state water projects. Based in its San Francisco office, Kate leads NRDC's work to protect and restore the freshwater ecosystems across the United States. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and also a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Alan Bacock is a member of the Big Pine Paiute tribe of the Owens Valley, and over the past 20 years has served indigenous communities to protect water, air, and land through various roles, including as water program coordinator for his tribe. In 2019, he was the recipient of the Connor Ballestewa Junior Environmental Award, which is bestowed annually among the 148 tribes in the Southwest to recognize the work of individuals who are improving human health and environmental conditions for tribal communities. Alan will not be speaking on behalf of his tribal government, but he has agreed to share his background as an individual tribal member who has worked within that government for many years. Dr. Peter Gleick is a world-renowned expert, innovator, and communicator on water and climate issues. He co-founded the Pacific Institute in 1987 and is currently its president emeritus. Peter has been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship and was elected to the US National Academy of Sciences. He serves on the boards of numerous journals and organizations and is the author or co-author of many scientific papers and 12 books, including The World's Water, Bottled and Sold, and a 21st Century Water Policy. Kate Bunney was born and raised in the UK. Surrounded by water on all sides, she took to water immediately, swimming and sailing as soon as she could. She has a degree with honors in psychology and a master's in women's studies. In 2012, Kate co-founded Walking Water as a way to inspire us to be in community and to be in relation with the waters and in the places we live. Walking Water already has a strong global following and is seen as a model in social action. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Jacob, let's start with you. What did you know or think you knew about water struggles in California before you started making this film?
I thought there's a drought going on and farmers are suffering. I thought farms in California were this small thing with a barn and a little windmill. I thought I was going to go out and make a short film that would be just really sympathetic to farmers' experience during drought, working with their hands, tilling the dry soil personally, growing food for our tables here in the cities, and focus a lot on how disconnected we all are from our food supply. I did not know where my water comes from. I didn't know that the water that humans use, only about 20% is used by cities and 80% is used by agriculture. It wasn't until I interviewed John Herrick, an attorney for the South Delta, that I learned about this thing called the Bay Delta Estuary. As I learned about the extreme mismanagement of our water resources in California and elsewhere, that family farms are largely giving way to big agricultural corporations exporting our water overseas, and the impending ecological crisis around our watersheds, I thought, this is an amazing story. I need to tell it. And there's so much here, it has to be a feature film.
Great. And how many people did you interview? And I mean, I know there's only a certain amount of time in the film, but I know also that you did a lot of background research. How many people did you talk to, do you think?
From inception to final cut, this film took me 5 years to make. More than half of that time, I was working on it only part-time. It started while I was a senior in college, but I was always doing research in the background. I read a number of books on the subject, but more importantly, as you ask, I interviewed over 70 people over the 4 years of physical production. Just over half of my interviews made it into the film. Those who didn't make the cut were essential to my research, but often didn't give me the exact soundbite I needed as I put this big puzzle together.
What are some other important lessons you think you learned while you were making this film about California's water?
Everyone really needs to learn where their water comes from. Water is life, as they say, and we are completely disconnected from our water sources. It's especially true in California, but it's still very true in developed countries around the world. We can't solve our water problems if the average person thinks water comes from the sink and shower. The second thing, I guess, is that people in cities, conserving water is really helpful, but it's just not enough to solve our water problems. Cities and residential use only make up 20% of the water humans use. If we're going to solve our water issues, we really have to deal with agriculture in a serious way as well.
Alan, let's move to you next. In the film, you provide historical context for the Los Angeles water story, and I've got to say, I was really glad that Jacob got to be able to put that in his film, because I think that's a part of the story that's, we've all seen Chinatown maybe, but that earlier part of the story has not been told as often. And the basics of it is that the water of the Owens River Valley was stolen from your people by settlers just before LA stole that water from the settlers. So my question then is, today, how or from whom does the Big Pine Paiute tribe get its water? And what control do your people have over that water?
Our reservation sits on 279 acres, and underneath that, the water belongs to the city of Los Angeles. And then, on other lands that are now owned by the city of Los Angeles, the tribe has retained water rights there. And so it creates a complicated mess, but there is a contractual obligation that the city of Los Angeles has to provide water to the reservation. And we receive that water through surface water from Big Pine Creek, which we use for irrigation. And then we also have wells that provide for our community that are pumping water into people's homes. But the what control we have over it is always like the next step, because there are unresolved water rights within because of this very strange conundrum that we find ourselves in.
And that gets us to then the issue of Native American sovereignty. In general, it's extraordinarily complex across the U.S. I mean, there are tribes that are recognized by treaty with the U.S. government. There are tribes that receive some recognition in treaties with third-party governments. There are acts of Congress and then executive actions, and then there are a whole bunch of tribal people who are not federally recognized at all. But so to narrow it down just a little bit, can you provide an overview of the tribal sovereignty landscape in California? Because it's a little different than I've experienced elsewhere in the country, and how tribal sovereignty in California affects the tribe's ability to protect and control their water future.
Well, tribal sovereignty is definitely a very complex issue, and it's tough to just look straight at California without looking at the bigger, broader picture first. I mean, one thing to recognize is tribal people have the most laws that are directed towards them than any other citizen within the U.S., just because of the different scenarios which exist. But one of those, there's an inherent responsibility, the federal Indian trust responsibility. That's a legal obligation where the United States has charged itself with a moral obligation to be responsible and to act in trust for Native peoples, and at least those who have been recognized by the federal government. And then you have, aside from that, tribal sovereignty, which is limited today because of different decisions that made by Congress, presidents, the courts, and then whatever has been left is to be able to provide against further encroachment from others, including states. And so California, being has a history that, when looking at tribal relations, is terrible. It wasn't that long ago that people would have been able to kill me and get money because of that. So we have a terrible history with the state of California. Now, moving forward, within the last decade, we've seen the state of California moving towards a way to help, I don't say create justice in the midst, but at least to acknowledge and to recognize that tribes are important, not only in history, but important towards the future. Because tribes in California, we're all at the same level as the United States government looks at us. And so state laws doesn't necessarily apply on tribal lands. Sometimes there are some differences there. But because of that, when the state is looking at like a water plan statewide to look towards the future and how it's going to provide for its citizens, it has to keep in mind the tribes that are also present within those boundaries, and they've opened up some of those doors to include us within their water plan, first as an appendix and then an inclusion within the water plan, so that whatever ends up happening into the future, we're doing that future together. And that just kind of shows some of the tribal sovereignty in the midst of state policy.
Which makes the water policy all that much more complex. There's a whole additional level of multiple governments. Yeah. Okay, Kate Poole. Hi, good to see you.
Hi, John.
Hi. So here's while we're on the vein of these really simple questions, while standing on one foot, can you describe how water has been allocated historically in California?
How water has historically been allocated in California is often described as first in time and first in right. But as I'm sure Alan can tell you, that is a misnomer, because the hundreds of Native American tribes who have been here for centuries often do not have much control over their own water resources or over historic resources that they used. It's probably better to describe it as a system where white Europeans arrived, set up camp along a river, or built a canal to bring the river to them and declared the water theirs. And that foundation, which has been pretty much how we have allocated water since the mid-19th century, is really built on a foundation of, a wildly inequitable system. It's based on stealing water from California's indigenous people, many of whom built their lives around rivers and salmon runs as a core part of their culture. And it also reflects racist property ownership laws that we had in place in the late 19th, early 20th century, where basically many non-white people were prohibited from owning property, including water rights. So that's the foundation of our water rights system in California. And, it continues today to be reflected in the way that we direct more water to the rich and powerful, who are able to drill deeper wells, for example, when aquifers begin to run dry, or to heavily lobby state and federal governments to maintain unsustainable levels of diversions from our rivers, while depriving poorer communities, and often largely communities of color, of access to safe and sufficient water supplies.
Yeah. Is that system, do you think, is it remarkably different from the rest of Western United States or elsewhere in the world, the system of rights that we have in California?
Well, there's some unique things about it. It's kind of, in legal terms, it's a hybrid between the prior appropriation system and a riparian system. But, many other places around the world, including the United States, reflect that same kind of power inequity in how they allocate their water supplies. We see the same struggles in places like Europe and China and Australia. But we've also, as Alan mentioned, are beginning to see some glimmers of hope in California. For example, there was a recent announcement after many, many years of battling, where the Klamath tribes have succeeded in cutting a deal to get 4 large dams taken down along the Klamath River system, which has really decimated their way of life, and the salmon runs on that river for many, many years. And those are now scheduled to come down in the next couple of years, and that's a true realization of first in time and first in right, and a real victory.
Right. That has been some good news in a sea of bad news recently. Hope to see that come to fruition after so many years. I've observed that when we talk about taking or allowing more water to remain in rivers, which would mean that less of it gets diverted, it provokes anxiety in the general public and decision makers. And so my question then is water really scarce for cities and residential uses? I mean, if environmental protections were improved, would people go without water or feel less secure in their water supplies?
There is no scarcity due to restrictions put on river protections or increased environmental protections. That's really a misnomer. We have, in our cities in California, we've steadily reduced our per capita water use over the years. And I doubt many people even notice, because it's through improvements such as more efficient toilets, more efficient shower heads, things that allow us to do the exact same things while using a lot less water. So those kind of measures, we still have a lot of space to do more in terms of those kind of measures, not wasting as much water in how we use it, and reusing it better through things like water recycling. Actually, Peter Gleick and I did a study several years ago that looked at the potential overall in California for water savings. And we found that through some simple measures that I've mentioned, recycling, stormwater capture, more efficient water use, we could save, more than 3 times as much water as anybody's calling for it to be kept in the Bay Delta system to restore the health of that river system. So there's huge potential there. We just need to buckle down and invest in it.
Is it the investment? Are we lacking money? Doesn't sound like we're lacking in ideas. Are we lacking money, or are we lacking a political will to take water from certain areas and redirect it to other areas?
It's a little bit of both. There is a lot of investment or a lot of funding available to invest in some of these local alternative water supply solutions. More would help many municipalities do that quicker, but there is a very entrenched set of very powerful interests who benefit tremendously from getting cheap water out of our river systems and pushing the costs of that onto the rest of us in terms of, a degraded environment. And those people fight very hard at any mention of, reducing how much water they take. And that has really been the big impediment to making progress and improving the health of our rivers and fisheries.
Excellent, thank you. That's a good point then to pivot to Peter to talk about some of these interests. One of the two main antagonists in the film River's End is the Westlands Water District, which is the largest agricultural water district in the country. Can you describe where Westlands water comes from and sort of what their right is to water?
Sure. So Kate described sort of the mishmash of and the long disturbing history of allocation of water rights in California, the taking of water originally from the native communities that lived here. Then the miners had water, and then agriculture came in, and big agriculture came in, and a whole set of institutions and water rights were set up that, as Kate described, was partly a first in time, first in right kind of a claim. Again, as Kate mentioned, that's not exactly accurate. It's kind of riparian rights, which is a more of an Eastern version. And the Westlands Water District is a relatively new player in California. They were created only, I think, in the 1950s. They have what's called junior water rights, where they get water if it's available in a really wet year, as opposed to senior water right holders who have been around longer and are more likely to get confirmed water even in dry years. And in part because Westlands has junior water rights, and in part because the quality of their land isn't so great, they've invested enormously, not so much in water per se, but in politics and in power. And they have managed politically to get access to water through, we have the saying, water flows uphill toward money in California, toward politics and power. And Westlands has been able to get water from both the Central Valley Project, the federal projects that run through the middle of the state, the state water project, they've tapped into some degree. They've managed politically to get a higher, more confirmed right, especially in recent years with the Trump administration, than previously available because of their political investments. And then third of all, they pump groundwater, which is a big problem in California. A significant amount of water that goes to agriculture comes from groundwater pumping. And I would note unsustainable groundwater pumping. As the movie noted, we overdraft groundwater enormously. We take out more groundwater than nature naturally recharges. And Westlands, in part because they have sort of unreliable surface water, has made a commitment to groundwater extraction and overdrafting of groundwater. And they've spent the money to drill 500-foot, 1,000-foot, 2,000-foot wells to dig deeper into this diminishing layer of groundwater. So they have a mix of water sources. It's been a mix of politics and power for them, but they are a big player, as the movie showed.
In the film, several people, I think you and others, emphasize that 80% of the developed water in California, the water that people use, 80% of that goes to agriculture, and 20% of it goes to all the other industries and municipal residential uses in the state. And I've heard that same number apply, that same split, the 80-20 split, apply to agriculture versus other human uses everywhere. Does that 80-20 split really occur regardless of agricultural systems or ag practices?
Well, so 80% of the water that humans use in California, approximately, goes to agriculture or irrigated systems. And 80% of the water that humans use worldwide, on average, goes to agriculture. So in that sense, it's sort of a common figure. It's, of course, not necessarily the same case. In Europe, there's very little irrigated agriculture. The vast majority of water goes to industrial use and to residential use. They don't have that much irrigated agriculture. But in a place where irrigated agriculture dominates, like worldwide and in California, the 80-20 split is pretty common. As Kate noted, we don't really have a shortage of water for urban uses in California. If we took more water out of agriculture, we don't really need it at the moment in the urban centers. There's much more potential, again, as Kate noted, to do more with the water already using in the cities, to use it more efficiently, to use more treated wastewater, to capture more local stormwater. And so there's this sort of myth that the farmers have propagated that the cities are trying to take the water away from the farms for the cities. And that's not really the case. What we really need to do is we need to think about how to return water to communities that have been deprived of water, native communities, communities in the Central Valley of farm workers that don't have access to safe water and sanitation, and especially the natural ecosystem, because a long time ago, 100% of the water was in the natural ecosystem. And so everything that we take out as humans has come at the expense of those systems. And of course, some of the most severe environmental problems we have in California are precisely associated with the fact that we've taken so much water out of those systems.
So how can agriculture, either in California or elsewhere, or both, use less water?
Yeah, so the good news is sort of like in our cities, we can do a lot more with the water we're already using. We can grow more food with much less water, with smarter irrigation systems, with soil moisture monitors that tell farmers precisely when the crops need to be watered, not watering on a random rotating schedule. And we're already seeing that in California. California farmers are typically very smart, and they're becoming more efficient. They're putting in more efficient irrigation systems and moving away from flood irrigation that loses a lot of unproductive water to evaporation. They're moving to smarter computer systems that let them manage the water that they have more carefully. We also need to rethink the kinds of crops that we grow. We grow water-intensive crops in places where maybe it doesn't make so much sense to grow water-intensive crops. So that's the good news. The bad news is that a lot of the trends in California agriculture are also in the wrong direction. We're moving toward millions of acres of what we call permanent crops, trees, pistachios, almonds, orchards, instead of field crops that, in the event of a severe drought, could be laid fallow for a year, or could be let to save that water to restore ecosystems. But these permanent crops, they require water in dry years, they require water in wet years, and that's put much more pressure, permanent pressure, on our rivers, on our groundwater systems, on our ecosystems. In the long run, to be honest, this is not, people don't like to talk about this much, but in order to bring our systems back into some semblance of sustainability, to restore some of the groundwater overdraft, I think quite a bit of agriculture in California is going to have to come out of production. If that means less production of food, that's not necessarily the case if we become more efficient in the remaining pieces of agriculture. But that's going to be a fight that we haven't had yet, and it's going to be another intense political one.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you led there, because that was a question that I encounter a lot, which is, if we reallocate the water to make it more just and equitable to people and the environment, does that mean that we'll have food shortages, or more rampant unemployment in farm communities than we already see?
So the best way to think about this concisely is, we know how to grow more food with less water. We could save a lot of water and not hurt agricultural production in this state at all. California is a wonderful place to grow food. The soils are fantastic. We have lots of water. We have a great system, but we could grow more food, or the same amount of food, with much less water. The political question, the policy question is, what do we do with that saved water? If the farmer saves water and then just puts it on expanded production, it doesn't restore ecosystems. It doesn't go to communities that don't have access to safe water. And that's what we're doing right now. So sometimes there's this argument, efficiency improvements don't really save water because farmers just apply it somewhere else and grow more food. But it doesn't have to be that way. We could save that water through these efficiency improvements that Kate and I have been describing. And that water could restore ecosystems. It could restore access to safe water and sanitation in in disadvantaged communities. But that requires a policy decision and requires political will.
Another area where there's anxiety sort of creeps into the conversations about water, particularly in California, is climate change. And I hear a lot that because of climate, the impending change in temperatures and hydrology, that those are reasons not to try and protect the Delta smelt or Chinook salmon in the Central Valley, because they're just going to be hit by climate change. But I wonder if the same skepticism if you would apply the same skepticism to some human activities, will it be possible to use water for farming or residential use the way we do now in 30 to 40 years under our climate change projections?
Yeah. So I'm a climate scientist and a hydrologist, both. I've done a lot of work on climate and water, and it's a little ironic to hear you describe that they're now finally acknowledging climate change is real and beginning to use it as an excuse not to protect some of these incredibly damaged and vulnerable systems and communities. That's of course the wrong message. We need to protect those systems no matter what, with or without climate change. Climate change is going to make some of those things more difficult, but it doesn't remove the imperative to deal with those challenges and the challenges that California water imposes. We know that climate change is real. We know that it's human caused. We know that some of the worst impacts are going to be on water resources through higher temperatures and more evaporation and changes in snowpack in the Sierra and flows into the Central Valley and changes in flood and drought frequency. That just means we need to integrate climate change into all of our water planning. We need to be smarter about the kinds of things we're already doing and the kinds of changes that we know we already have to make. Kate and I have worked on a situation where higher temperatures in the Sacramento River have killed 95% of salmon runs in certain years when we have failed to protect the temperature limits that protect ecosystems in the Sacramento River. That's going to be more and more of a problem with climate change as temperatures continue to rise, but it's not an excuse for not protecting those incredibly important resources.
As a fish biologist, I couldn't agree more. Thanks. Kate, Bunney, let's turn to you now. Hi.
Hi.
Can you describe your organization, Walking Water's mission and work a little bit?
Sure. Walking Water really arrived in 2012 in Paiute, and I'm the co-founder together with Gigi Coyle. And it really arrived to us through vision. So it was really something that was embodied and almost like a prayer that arrived to us then by the waters there in Paiute. And it's asking us to walk with the land and walk with the waters. And literally, I had been in the US for 3 days. I've worked in many different places in the world, mainly in conflict areas. And I knew nothing of the story here in the US. And so I went away and learned what that meant to walk with the land and walk with the waters there in Paiute and in many other places in the US, and was horrified really by what I learned, and realized that it was an important prayer to carry through. So our essence is to restore relations, to restore all our relations with each other, with people, with lands, and essentially with the waters. That's what we focus on. We invited Alan and the Big Pine Paiute tribe gave us permission to walk through the lands there. And we went from Mono Lake down to Los Angeles, walking with around 40 people each year. We split it up into 3 years. We invited water experts from all around the world, tribal representatives, community members, artists, activists, and we walked each year carrying our own belongings and really went to bear witness, to listen to the stories, to really receive the stories and the prayers of what has happened there in that part of the world and how that relates to many other places in the world too, and to see how we can find the ways that we can come together. So we can start to connect together, to listen to each other, to understand what are the water stories and the water prayers, and to create vision together. So it's, you know, it's an essential part that once we know that we've got a problem, how do we get out of it? And a big part of that is how do we create vision together to really be able to see what is beyond the problem. And that makes a big difference to how we get there, you know?
The problems that you have been studying here, the Mona Lake one in particular, does that share are there common features with other water struggles, you know, elsewhere in the world? I mean, you mentioned what's behind the problem. Is there something behind all of these little water problems that's really a common problem globally?
Yes, I think there is a common problem globally. Part of what we worked with as our guidelines was that relationship between the local and the global, which is why we invited global experts to come and walk with us. So some of the parallels are, you know, generally how water is seen as a resource rather than a life-giving being. I worked a lot in Israel and Palestine. And to be honest, the first time I went to Paiute, for me, there are so many parallels to that. How water has been used to oppress and to control peoples, how we occupy and colonize different areas that have the resources that we want. So those patterns are happening a lot. The other side of that is when we bring in the global, we can also see some of the incredible work that happens on a global level to find solutions. So not all countries have a huge amount of money and a huge amount of scientists and amazingly knowledgeable people to be able to find the solution. They have to do it with not a lot of money, but with a lot of dedication and a lot of love, and a lot of community power. And so that's an important story, I think, to bring to the water story that is here in California as well. I could bring in just one man called Rajendra Singh, who Alan also knows well. He walked with us every year. He's called the Waterman of India. And he's incredible man who's managed to regenerate 7 rivers there in India, and a lot of it through community presence and power. And that's amazing. And that's the story that we need to hear. And so that we do get, you know, kind of the science is important. The politics, knowing that is really important. And then just the heart and the love and the dreaming and the commitment to change something is also part of that narrative.
I feel like water, climate, so many of our problems today are, you know, a result of or have the effect of making people feel powerless. So I'm wondering, you know, for a person who's just watched Jacob's film River's End and is becoming aware of these water struggles in their own backyard, maybe, what can a person do to motivate change regarding scarcity and water justice?
Yeah. First, I want to thank all of you because, you know, when I first arrived to learning about the California water story, I was, you know, completely in a cloud. I had no idea what was going on. And the whole thing is so complicated. And there's a part where it's very consciously done, right? Because the normal kind of lay person is like, well, what can I do? You're disempowered right from the beginning. And so there was something that I really liked about this film was, you know, and every time I watch a film or read the story, I'm like, aha, okay, there's another piece and another piece. So I got a good next part of the story and a next part of the understanding with the film. So I really appreciated that. And thank you all for sharing your part and your dedication in this. In terms of narrative, it's like, whose narrative is it? You know, we heard just now from Alan, we've heard from Kate and Peter that, you know, one, it's like nearly always the narrative that is the indigenous, the black, the brown, non-binary, they're consistently not given space to share story. Their narrative is not the dominant narrative. And I think we need to change that. And so that more and more people can feel that they have a space to be motivated in, and that we can all make an impact in that way, right? So that feels really important, that we change the narrative on the fact that water is scarce. You know, again, I feel like much of the time that's a conscious decision to stop us doing anything, and instead fall into a place of fear. And we're much less likely to act and really take control when we're in fear, right? If we're feeling empowered, then we're ready to go. We've got a lot of energy and we can be committed in that. So those kind of things, I think, are really important, that we keep changing that narrative and say, no, water is not scarce, right? And still, we've got to do something. So let's go, you know? I think that to motivate people, we need to keep understanding what the story is, and to keep bringing it back to ourselves. So one of the important parts of why we did Walking Water was we wanted people to see this is what happens when we take this amount of water and take it down 600 miles through a pipe into this huge metropolis, right? On one of the phases of the walk, we walked 2 weeks without seeing any open water bodies. Now that brings up a lot in us. When we're in the Mojave Desert, it's plus 100 every day. There's 40-mile-per-hour winds. We have to really hold on to ourselves, and there's no water. Now that's an embodied experience of really finding out what that does to us in our system, in our thinking. And that's the kind of experience that changes if we can embody it and understand that on a different level.
That's right. That's really a good image to have in mind. That's what scarcity really looks like when you've hiked for 2 weeks and not seen any water. Okay, so turning to the future then, and sort of starting with you, Jacob, asking you a similar question is like, now that you've seen California's struggles with water allocation from the inside to the outside, do you think that California's water issues resemble other national or international issues? And what does that comparison tell you about ways that we might approach or solve conflicts over water?
Yeah, I remember asking Tom Birmingham of Westland's Water District this exact question, and he just laughed and said to me, I'm not going to answer your question. It would offend too many of my friends. It's interesting that Westlands represents many of California's largest corporate farms, which make up a select few, rich people, employs migrant workers from consistently distressed communities, and diverts too much water from our rivers. I'm not sure if Tom had that in mind when he, bit his tongue there. But to answer your question, I can think of plenty of other global industries that use up our natural resources, don't provide adequately for workers, and harm the planet for a profit. So, oil, gas, you name it. Unchecked capitalism is the driver of these problems. I hope that we can find a way to put proper monetary values on our natural resources so that it's either no longer profitable to deplete them, or set limits strict enough that we can't use them unsustainably. This has to happen in California, and it has to happen around the world.
Kate, Poole, what do you believe are the most viable solutions to reduce water demand? And are there specific solutions that will help not only in California, but should be applied elsewhere in the world?
Well, yeah, and I'm inspired by Kate Bunney's statement about, we need to feel empowered. We've talked about a number of the solutions. They are not complicated. They don't require high tech. They're pretty straightforward. Use less water, reuse more water. And there are people making these decisions. This is not some black hole that determines how water gets to one place and doesn't get to another. We are now entering our second critically dry year here in California. And there are increasing conversations in the press and elsewhere about who's getting water and who isn't. And I really encourage people to pay attention to who is getting water, because we often hear cries from people who, like Wesleyan's, who feel like they're not getting enough, who always feel that way. But this year, there will be mostly, a set of big agricultural interests in the Sacramento River Valley, up in the Feather River, who mainly grow rice and flood irrigate rice, who will likely get about 3 times as much water that the city of Los Angeles uses in an entire year to grow rice in a year like this, when several other people are being shorted. That is a decision that can be changed. If we think that that is unjust and inequitable and not a wise use of our water resources, Governor Newsom controls many different state agencies who can do something about that. Most specifically, the State Water Resources Control Board can require those people to keep more water in stream to help restore our salmon runs and our rivers. And that benefits all of us. So focus on who has the power to change the decisions, because somebody does, and make your voice heard, because the existing system is not set in stone, and we need to create pressure to change it. We want it changed, and that's true everywhere.
Kate, Bunney, how do we allocate water justly now, given that we may have made very bad and harmful decisions in the past? I mean, how can we undo the damage, in particular, maybe the cultural damage that's been done by the way we've allocated water in the past?
I want to follow on from Kate and just say, yes, it is exactly like who is making the decisions, and let's change that. We need all of the groups that are represented, Indigenous, Black, Brown, white people, farmers, all of the people that live in our world right now need to be represented in the circle to really make the decisions together. I think it's the only way that we're really going to have an allocation which is essentially fair, and that really serves everybody in the way that what we need, we can receive, as well as the lands, right? In how to undo, I don't think we can undo. I think we need to recognize, and we need to respect and grieve for what has happened. There needs to be, like a whole system of truth and reconciliation processes, reparations to those that have experienced the most harm and damage from this water system, which is basically based on, we'll take it from there and put it there, without regard for who lives there and what lives there. So I believe that it really needs a deep process of grief and acceptance of that and recognition of that.
Thank you. Peter, you say in the film that if California can't solve its water allocation problems, then there's little hope that we'll solve water conflicts elsewhere. Are there places that are getting this right? And if so, what are they doing that California could do more of?
So maybe that was an optimistic California perspective. What I really was saying is we're one of the richest regions in the world, in money and in intellect and in technology and in awareness of some of these issues. And yet our water system is terrible politically and culturally and economically and socially. So I would like to think that we could solve our water problems in California, given the resources, and I don't just mean water, I mean all of those resources that we have, but it's going to require a different way of thinking and a different way of power than we have in California at the moment. And that's not an easy thing, as anyone who's looked at California or lived here for a while knows. And there are places around the world where smart, innovative things are happening, the kinds of things that we want to happen here, where really efficient water use has been pushed and supported, where wastewater is collected and treated to an incredibly high standard and reused in its entirety almost, for example, in Singapore, and in Namibia in Africa, where they've been doing this for decades. Smarter irrigation technologies in the Middle East are increasingly prevalent, driven in part by the absolute scarcity there. I mean, we're water rich compared to many parts of the world, and there are places where they're already moving toward much more efficient water use. So we see examples of ecosystem restoration. The Elwha Dam in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State came down in 2014, I guess it was, or 2015, and the salmon runs are being restored in the Elwha River in the Northwest. Kate mentioned the potential that we're finally going to do that possibly on the Klamath. There are things that we know how to do that we could do much more of in California. And there are lessons from all around the world that we could learn.
It's good to know that there's some hope. So I'll turn to Alan for the closing word. Alan, is there hope? How does this end? I mean,
yeah, is there hope is a great question, and one that, it's taking a look far backwards to be able to get far forward. And when we look back and we see what values we've placed on things, we can look at history books, we can look at books of civilization. It's about domination, and that domination comes through power and control and money. And those things then are the things that feed the fuel. They are the things that we value and continue to move forward. Is that who we want to define ourselves? Because if we do that, we're going to continue to have these policies that will be built on power, control, money. And so it's really looking back to see what the values are to move forward, to see where do we want our values to stand from henceforth. And in looking at that, looking at my own culture and recognizing that we had a different value system than what's been in the civilization book, and we've been called uncivilized. And you know what? I'll take that as a badge of honor that I am part of an uncivilized people, because the things that we value are things like gratitude, being able to go out and to hunt or to gather, and to first, before going out and doing those activities, praying and being very thankful for the sacrifice that others have made so that I could have life. And when we take on those attitudes of gratitude, what happens when we start to then create things out of it? All of a sudden things start to change, because it's not just about me, it's about where I fit within. And it's also about reciprocity in the relationships that we have all the way around with humans, with other life forms, that when we take into account that we are part of and important to the whole, then we start to develop things that make sense, and stop the value system on how much I can control, and stop how much I can receive out of it, to how can everyone receive, how can everything receive what it needs to be able to to have what is needed into the future. And so if we all become uncivilized and take those notions on and start to look again at these indigenous cultures, which have been around thousands of years, and instead of taking their values and saying, you need to conform into what we're saying is the right way, to actually look at the true benefits that these uncivilized people provide in to have a future for all.
I love that vision. Thank you, Alan. That's all the questions that I have for you all. I feel even more now like I want all of us to drive up to Alan's home in the Owens River Valley, which is my favorite place in the state, and like hang out around a campfire and really get to the bottom of this. But this was a great conversation. So thank you all for joining in.
But let's do that too, John.
Okay. Yeah.